5 bitter years they suffered, humiliated, brutalized, dispirited. Holland living and dying under Nazi occupation. Then, 1945, the Canadians fight their way in. The Germans surrendered. Liberation at last. The sweet taste of freedom.
50 years after VE Day, Holland remembers the liberators. From Apeldoorn Holland, here is Peter Mansbridge.
Welcome to the town square in Apeldoorn Holland. In the next hour, we want to relive 3 glorious days in this country. 3 days when Holland paused to remember the deliverance from Nazi occupation 50 years ago. The liberators were Canadians, and to be a Canadian in Holland half a century later is to get a first-hand understanding of what grateful means. The Dutch have not forgotten. Those who lived through the terrible years of occupation and those who've only heard about it, they all appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf by soldiers from a faraway land. The 50th anniversary of the Dutch liberation, of course, coincides with the 50th anniversary of VE Day. So most of Europe was celebrating. We'll touch on ceremonies in Britain and Russia and take you to Ottawa as well, to Canada's National War Memorial. But we start here in Holland, where thousands of Canadian veterans proudly return to the scene of their remarkable accomplishment. CBC Television News broadcast much of it live. We're now proud to bring you the highlights of our coverage. Special coverage from Wageningen of where the ceremony took place, German forces surrendering to Canadian troops 50 years ago. Matthew Holton, one of the great Canadian journalists of his day, and still 50 years later, hearing Matthew Holton's voice describe what happened in Wageningen that day, May 5th, 1945, brings back many memories, not only for those who first heard the report a half a century ago, but for those now who are hearing it for the first time. What we've done is we've taken Matthew Holton's radio report and married it to the pictures that are available of what happened that day. It was first heard in Canada on May 6th, Holton's report coming from Germany about what he'd witnessed in Wageningen, Holland. Here it is, Matthew Holton, 50 years later.
When I saw a small car coming along toward us, it was a wretched, shabby German Volkswagen, the equivalent of our Jeep. In it, there was the driver and 2 German officers, the German general and a saber-scarred colonel who was his interpreter. They were received formally and coldly by Lieutenant General Charles Folks, commanding the 1st Canadian Corps. With him was Prince Bernhard of Holland, representing the Dutch government. General Folks led the German general into the littered and broken bar of a ruined hotel to hear his term. The war correspondents present were invited to come in and listen. The German general wore a black leather coat and a shabby peaked cap. He was a red-faced, brutish-looking man. He was submissive, even abject, the very picture of a beaten man.
May I ask first if General Blasiewicz has had a copy of the order to surrender?
Der Oberfeldwebel möchte wissen, ob Herr Generaloberst eine Abschrift gehabt haben von diesen Bedingungen der Übergabe.
Ich habe, nein. Well, is the General prepared to accept my reading of this and prepared to negotiate for turning his troops over to me?
I will, yes.
So it was over. When the people heard the news on the radio, they ran into the streets to tell their friends, with 120,000 Germans laying down their arms in an almost hysterical surrender, begging us, as von Blaskowitz did, to protect them from the angry Dutch. Today the world is happy. 10 million men pinch themselves and feel that they're still alive, and will soon be lying on the lawn listening to their wives and babies. But one phrase keeps running through my head. It's an old phrase that every schoolboy knows. The words of a Canadian who died in the last war. Words more solemn and meaningful than ever before. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies blow in Flanders fields. And now, not only on Flanders fields, poppies grow, I've seen them, at Regal Buto and Agira in Sicily, and up the length of Italy, in Normandy, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Regal Buto, Moro River, Carpiquet, and the appalling hill at Apeldoorn. The sun shines now. But remember these names, Canada, because they're written on your heart. This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Germany.
50 years later, Matthew Halton's report on the surrender of German forces to Canadian troops in Wageningen, Holland, at the St. John the Baptist Nativity Church, a Roman Catholic church just next door to the old Hotel de Wereld, the World Hotel in Wageningen, where the surrender was signed. And inside the church at this hour, the beginnings of a special ceremony marking that day, 50 years later. It's National Liberation Day here in Holland.
State Secretary of Canada. ambassador of Luxembourg, the ambassador of Russia, the ambassador of France, the ambassador of the United Kingdom, the ambassador of Australia, and the ambassador of New Zealand.
Roman Catholic Church, where the special ceremonies are taking place, marking the 50th anniversary of the surrender of German forces here in Holland to Canadian troops, led by General Charles Folks, in a building not very far away from that church, just in fact about a half a block away. The old World Hotel in Wageningen is where the surrender ceremonies took place. General George Kitching was one of the Canadian representatives at the table during the surrender ceremony. I had a chance to sit down there with him just a couple of days ago to go through his memories of what happened inside that room in May of 1945. Here's that interview. General, I know you've been back in this room many times over the last 50 years, but it must provoke certain emotions. How do you feel when you come back in this room?
It's almost as if they're ghosts, as if you are the German on the opposite side of the table, Peter. It was full of people then. Any movement, it was a very quiet room. Most of the windows are smashed, of course. But the reporters in here were along that wall behind you. And in spite of the fact that there were 30 Canadian reporters, they were quiet. They weren't noisy or unpleasant. It could have been, you know. They're waiting, and finally. So really, to me, any movement in here, you expect to see a German hat or one of ours.
First time you walked in and Blaskowitz was here, was there a sense of history on your part? Did you know you were entering a moment that would in fact be frozen in time?
No, I don't think so. I think we were so glad it was all over that I think any sense of history, I'm sorry, it wasn't with me then. It was with me within 2 weeks of it, when you saw the result of the meeting here, and you saw the Germans going out. Then I felt there was a real sense of, to me, at that time.
Now, there's a saying about the Canadian involvement in the fight in Northwest Europe, in the year almost from the landings in D-Day right through here to Holland, that you can trace the steps made by the Canadian troops in the various battles that took place by following the gravestones. And in many ways that's true. Many war cemeteries dot the landscapes from France right here up to Holland. And one of the special ceremonies that took place at just one of the grave cemeteries here in Holland yesterday was at the town of Holten. Let me show you where Holten is in relation to Apeldoorn. First of all, Holten, one of the Canadian War cemeteries, a little north and east of Apeldoorn, about a 45-minute drive, a beautiful cemetery where more than 1,300 Canadians who fought in the Second World War lie buried. Well, at Holten yesterday, special ceremony, and the CBC's Anne McMillan went there to cover it, and here's what she found.
The memorial service at the Canadian Cemetery at Holten was especially poignant for two Canadian sisters. Their father lies buried here. George Buttimer died just 1 month before the end of the war. This is the first time Sandra Dickey from Charlotte, New Brunswick, and Sheila Wood from Orillia, Ontario, have visited his grave. Sheila was just 2 months old when her father was shot by a German sniper. Sandra was 4.
We thought it would be very emotional. Yes. We have cried every day since we've been in Holland, especially because of the love of the Dutch people for us. When we got on the bus and saw the sign, "Thank you, boys," that started us crying. And when most of these boys are 19 and 20 years old, they were just boys. It gives a new meaning, you know. And I wonder, would our 19 and 20-year-old Canadian boys do this today for another country, you know?
But the words on his tombstone,
all he had hoped for,
all he had, he gave to save mankind.
I believe that was his attitude. And to think every Christmas Eve the children light a candle on every grave in this cemetery. And on this day they lay flowers. We did not know that. The Dutch teach their children very well to remember.
It's worth coming for sure.
In a way, it's our way of saying we're proud of our father for what he did.
Well, any visit to a Canadian War cemetery, an extremely moving experience, and obviously a very moving experience for those 2 women who found the marker that is the final resting place of their father. Well, we're going to go back to Wageningen now, where they are finished the church service and getting ready for the parade that will be taking place in the middle of the city center. Veterans arriving. Many of them extremely proud men who've been offered the opportunity to be placed in vehicles for this the variety of parades this weekend. Many of them saying no, they want to march, assuming that the march isn't too long. Very hot. This temperature isn't great for marching in, no matter how old you are, and so there'll be a great deal of care here for those involved in the parade. Well, Prince Bernhard is here. He's not been well over these past few months, and there was a great deal of concern about whether or not he would make it back here for the ceremony taking place today. Welcomed by the Dutch officials, and will be taking the salute on the march past of the various veterans. A mixture in this particular parade of both past and present members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Obviously, the veterans couple there in the front leading the Armed Forces band, and then behind members of the Royal Canadian Legion. Well, an emotional moment for viewers, I'm sure, watching this parade, but also a very emotional moment for those who have been watching the parade from on the ground here, especially those Canadians who've come along with their husbands who were veterans in the Second World War, and one of them is with Brian Stewart right now. Brian?
Thank you, Peter. Marion Hellman, when you walked up the street here with other wives, there were cheers and ovations.
As soon as we rounded the corner and they saw our Canadian flags and banners, cheers, almost deafening. Wonderful.
And what did the wives feel about that? I think
it's just very grateful that my husband got back, and very grateful that Europe is free, and we just hope that peace can be all over the world one day very soon.
Well, if it's hot out there, they don't seem to be bothered by the heat. They're enjoying every moment of this march. marching straight by the hotel where the surrender ceremony took place. That's it there in the background. It was the winter of hunger, the Dutch literally starving. Canadian soldiers in a ferocious fight against the Nazis. The people of Holland desperate for food. And now the Canadians became providers, by land and by air, when food was life itself.
50 years after VE Day, how the hungry were saved.
Canadian forces played such an important role not only in liberating this country, but in getting food to those who were starving. And there were tens of thousands of people in this country who were starving to death in the last days of the Second World War. And an important part of the role we played here was how we got the food to those starving Dutch. We have to remember that much of Holland was liberated on the eastern side by Canadian troops, but as you can see from this map, much of the western part of Holland, including the heavily occupied areas, the cities Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam, still under Nazi occupation. Well, let's try and look back at some of the historic footage that's still available 50 years later of what happened then, and also talk to some of the people who remember what happened then and benefited from the fact of the food drops that took place 50 years ago. Here's Anne McMillan with a report on what it was like here half a century ago in the dying days of the war when the Allies got food to the starving Dutch.
The starved, rickets-ridden bodies of this Dutch family.
They called it the Spring of Hunger. As the war moved into its final stages, 150,000 people in Holland were literally starving to death.
Living testimony to the state of health of thousands of Dutch children.
I saw before my eyes that people dropped dead in the street. And the people were so weak, they couldn't walk. And
nearly half the country's population was crowded into large cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, cities still occupied by the Germans.
The Germans took away everything for themselves, so we really had nothing to eat. You couldn't buy anything, and well, what we ate was most of it tulip bulbs. Terrible. Well, they are absolutely tasteless.
By spring 1945, even the tulip bulbs had been used up. On April the 28th, with war still raging, Canadian officers met their German counterparts to try to set up a humanitarian operation to feed the Dutch.
A truce is declared as the Germans are brought to and from the meetings by Canadian transport.
The Germans agreed to a temporary ceasefire. Food and fuel would be allowed through enemy lines. Airdrops started the next day. Planes from Bomber Command supplied 500,000 ration packs in a matter of hours. In Rotterdam, the drop was watched by Govert Vanderburg.
Well, it was a beautiful sight. We naturally enjoyed because we felt this was about the end of the war, that the Germans had accepted this.
Deliveries by road started on May the 2nd, 3 days before the German surrender in Holland.
Finally, the signal comes, and the convoys move through the enemy line.
One truck crossed the truce line every minute, carrying 1,000 tons of food each day.
They really had it bad. You see the children, how gaunt and pale and frail they look.
Corporal Albert Wade of the Royal Canadian Dragoons escorted the convoy.
That's about what their daily food take was.
That's really something.
Yeah. A couple of pieces of meat if they could find it.
665 calories.
Yeah. Imagine us trying to live on that, yeah.
Look
at this poor little fella. Never knew what happened. The people that I saw on the way, a lot of them were begging and crying. They were starving. They were thin, gaunt-looking, poor individuals, and children especially. Oh, we'd give them tins of biscuits and tea, and, well, that was like giving them a turkey dinner at Christmas time.
He still remembers the response he got from one Dutch family.
And I don't know how he ever found us. He came back to where we were. He found the camp, came right to us, and his father had been saving up brand new shoes, brown shoes. He brought them, gave them to us. Say thanks. That's the kind of people they were.
The remarkable story of getting food to the starving in Holland. Well, back now to Nijverdal, and food drop taking place now, the symbolic food drop. And I can wait for these to hit ground. If it's anything like last weekend, there are small plastic bags with a small bun in it just to symbolize what happened here half a century ago when it was so crucial to get food to those who were starving. Well, those blue look like paper mache being dropped from the aircraft. Some of those dropped right into the town square. Back to Anne McMillan in Nijverdal, who has a chance before the parade begins to talk to a couple more veterans. Anne?
Well, I found two really interesting ones this time for you, Peter, because they've never been here before, and they're only here now because Dutch Canadians raised $58,000 to send 35 veterans from Vancouver over here. I'm going to start with you, Gus Abel. You were with the Saskatoon Light Infantry. First time back, what's it like?
Oh, it's just wonderful. See, when we were here, when I was here, I didn't really know how the Dutch people suffered, and when I got home, then I could suffer with them as well, because I lost three of my friends from our school. So I know what it's like.
Now, Bill, you were with 4th Div in the service. Signal Corps, excuse me. Now, you liberated this place.
Well, very close to it. I was through Apeldoorn, and I came over just after D-Day on Juno Beach. And it was absolutely wonderful. We expected to be treated really well, but this is up beyond all our expectations. There's just no way we could have been treated better than we have been here.
A good crowd, as you can see, in attendance in Nijverdal once again. And this is a smaller community. I'm not sure of the exact population. It would be about half the size of Apeldoorn at the most, in the 40 to 50,000 range. Many of the vehicles being used this time around are the old vintage Army vehicles from the Second World War. Organizers were expecting about 160 Canadian veterans for this parade in Nijverdal. You've got to imagine there are parades going on throughout the countryside big communities and small throughout central Holland over this weekend. One of the biggest expected here in Apeldoorn tomorrow. As the veterans are circulating through the young Dutch kids, giving out Canadian pins. Imagine some who have regimental pins that they've had made up, giving those out as well, but Canadian flags here in this case. As the Dutch children have heard so many of the stories over the years and grow up through school systems that teach them about the Canadians' role in the liberation of their country, now getting tangible proof of the men who fought the battles here in their communities 50 years ago. From Nijverdal, concluding with that wonderful song, Thank You Canada, by the Dutch children who have been working on that for the last few months, getting ready for that performance. Westerbork, about an hour and a half away from Apeldoorn, and it was the collection point. Dutch Jews, after they were picked up by German forces, were taken to Westerbork and then moved on to different concentration camps where, of course, so many of them met their end. Well, there was a special ceremony at Westerbork.
Once a week, a train with loaded freight wagons was leaving to an unknown terminus. On the freight lists were numbers, and the numbers represented men, women, children, and babies, all marked by a discriminating star. More than 100,000 prisoners went by this train to the same destination, death. On April 12, 1945, courageous Canadians were here to liberate Camp Westerbork.
God of all the living, we are gathered here today in Westerbork. Remember, for the good souls of all those Jews who were killed during the Second World War and put on transport from this place, Westerbork. Remember all the people who were killed during those terrible years. With a broken heart, remember all those people, children, old people, young people, who were taken out of their homes and brought to concentration camps where they were killed by murderers who didn't know any mercy.
Canadian blood on the beaches of Normandy, across the French countryside, through Belgium, and then spilled fighting Nazis in the mud of Holland. The survivors were welcomed as liberators. The dead are honored in sad silence.
50 years after VE Day, a part of Holland, forever Canadian.
Some very poignant scenes from the Canadian War Cemetery at Groesbeek, just along the Dutch-German border. Home, final resting place for more than 2,300 Canadians buried there after their last battles in the Second World War. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, the head of the Canadian delegation here today. Mrs. Chrétien with him. Prime Minister arrived in Holland last night, attended a number of different ceremonies here already, and today arrives at Groesbeek for the ceremony at the Canadian War Cemetery. Prime Minister Wim Kok in the background. Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Princess Margriet of the Netherlands beside Prime Minister Chrétien. A contingent of the Canada Remembers Guard of Honor. Playing of the National Anthem, Canada Remembers Band, and a Guard of Honor.
Your Royal Highness, Mr. Prime Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs. On behalf of the people of Canada, I want to thank Her Royal Highness for joining us today at this special ceremony. The royal family has a very special place in the hearts of Canadian veterans and all Canadians. We are proud that when this land was in the hands of brutal occupiers, the royal family was able to find refuge in Canada. Indeed, Her Royal Highness was born in our nation's capital. Your royal family was safe an ocean away. A symbol of hope and defiance was assured, and a friendship between our two nations was born. It is a friendship forged in the darkest hour of the 20th century, a time when evil dominated this continent, when hatred ruled, and when the fate of the world stood in the balance. It was a time of terror and evil, but also a time of great courage and sacrifice. Words and dates and maps can't measure pain. They can't measure sacrifice. They can't measure loss. But the legacy of those Canadians who fought here is not found in history books. It is found in the smile of a Dutch child who lives a free, decent life today because of what these brave men did half a century ago. In the gratitude of those who were here then, in the warmth with which we have been received in this country. Your legacy is nothing less than the Canada of today. What we have today, we have because of what you did half a century ago. We will continue to build a society that is worthy of your sacrifice. We will not let you down.
Ceremony taking place at the cemetery in Grosbeek. It is not the only one in Holland, the official Canadian War Cemetery. Canadians lie buried in a number of cemeteries throughout this country, but there are three main ones. Grosbeek is one, and Holton is another one, north and east of Apeldoorn. And some thoughts about not only the cemetery at Holton, but Canadian war cemeteries in general. Here they are now.
Cemeteries are a place for cliches. It's a cliche to say that Canadian war cemeteries are beautiful, but this cemetery here at Holton in the central Netherlands is the most beautiful Canadian war cemetery I have ever seen. It's a cliche to say that war kills young men, and certainly to walk along the rows of gravestones here and to see the 19, 20, and 21-year-olds is very depressing. It's depressing, too, to remember that most of these men knew only depression and war, and it's sad to think that that is all Canada could give them. It's also a cliche to say that the liberation of Holland was easy, but when you look around here at the hundreds of graves, you can see that there was some serious fighting. Poets have a cliche, too. April is the cruelest month, and for those Canadians who died in April 1945, April truly was the cruelest month.
Well, you've seen 2 days of events so far, and there have been countless moments of high emotion. If you've laughed and if you've cried, well, you have not been alone. But now we're going to show you our last day in Apeldoorn, the National Parade of Liberators through the town. On this day, in this place, Canada was written on every heart. Well, there's General George Kitching, was at the table of the surrender at Bogganigan of German forces to Canadian troops on May 5th, 1945, and today he leads the parade through the streets of Apeldoorn. And the first groups of Canadian veterans beginning their walk through. I mean, you can just look at the size of these crowds. Amazing. Vantage points from home windows to the stands to right beside the street. Brian Stewart. Brian.
Thank you, Peter. I was talking earlier about the Dutch families bringing their children out here. Why did you come bring this little girl to the parade today?
Because I think it's very important for them to see what was happening 50 years ago. And they like it. They like it very much. This is the other one.
You know, your son must have shaken about 1,000 hands already.
Yes, I think so.
You see many of the veterans carrying flowers. Now, those flowers have been given to them by members of the crowd. They've been bringing literally tons of flowers into Apeldoorn for the last 24 hours, and many of them are being passed from the crowd to the veterans as they walk through the streets here. Some of the vets choosing to take a ride as opposed to marching, and who can blame them? They marched through these roadways before, and and with the opportunity of the ride in those vehicles, especially as it's been awfully warm here all week. It's just been a spectacular week of weather. The vast majority of the vets walking and shaking hands with the crowd.
Hey, you're having a pretty easy ride here.
Yes, that's the only way to travel.
What do you think of the parade?
Oh, beautiful, wonderful. You know, you can't describe it. You know how it is to...
Did you expect anything like this?
Never, never. We went to a little place day before yesterday, and it was the same way. It's sure nice. I guess they haven't forgotten we haven't either.
You know, it's probably going to be hours, if not days, before we get a real final estimate on the numbers of people here. But you just have to look at these shots. They can barely move down the streets here. And this stretches over a couple of kilometers. Organizers said they were hoping for 300,000. They probably got it. An incredible size crowd here.
I must say, Peter, as I move back here, I've covered a lot of events in my years, but I have never, ever seen crowds in celebration like this. It literally is like a liberation here. How are you enjoying the parade?
It's fantastic, and the people are wonderful. I love Holland.
It's unbelievable as far as that goes. I never think I'd get this big a parade at all once.
How's it feel being a hero?
Lovely.
Oh, amazing sights. Amazing moments here, 50 years after they first came through. let's go back into the crowd. Ann McMillan.
How are you doing?
It is unbelievable. It's just hard to believe that this is true. It's just like a dream. Because 50 years ago, when we liberated these places, people came out like this, and there were tears in their eyes. It's wonderful.
What has impressed you the most today?
The children, mostly the children. And the smiles, and it just, everybody is so happy, and it's enough to make you break up a little bit. The children are very fantastic. It's just unbelievable. The warmth and the smiles and the gratification, it's hard to explain. It's just very inspiring.
Well, excitement in the crowd, excitement in the march. Down to Brian Stewart.
What's it like with trying to control the crowd here?
It's nearly impossible. Everyone wants to touch the veterans.
It's a little bit emotional for me. I remember I wasn't here 50 years ago, and but I can feel what my parents have felt 50 years ago with all the Canadian and Dutch together. They celebrate their liberation.
How's this parade going?
The parade's going just great. It's the best parade I've ever been in. I don't have to keep in step. I can go and talk to people.
You don't
It's just marvelous.
You don't have to follow orders either, do you?
Well, people try. I try to give them, and nobody listens to me.
Okay, thanks.
That's wonderful, Brian. Well, they're clearly enjoying this moment, coming back 50 years later, and to the warmth, the applause, the love, and the affection of those who've gathered here to watch them march by one more time. But this route is a couple of kilometers long. On a normal day, it would take you about 20 to 25 minutes to walk this route, so it gives you a sense of how long it is. And it also gives you a sense of how many people must be here, because it's like this all along the route.
How are you enjoying this today?
Very great parade.
So is it all worth it being back here today?
Oh yeah, I'm so happy. My wife talked me into it, and I'm glad.
It's just fabulous. The reception from the people in Holland has just been out of this world, believe me. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Now, still for as far as you can see, the vehicles and the veterans and the bands still pouring through on the streets of Apeldoorn. Well, it's hard to leave a scene like that as the vets getting kisses again 50 years later. This is Lieutenant Betty Campbell. She was a nursing sister in World War II. She's from Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, now living in Toronto. She served in Normandy, Rouen, France, Antwerp, then Holland. She remembers being in Holland on VE Day.
We were in Holland on VE Day, and I guess it was a relief. We had a very busy time in Holland with Canadian casualties, and so I guess it was almost a relief to think that it was finally over. And we had a bonfire, and we had a supper, and the boys were looked after from the kitchen very, very well. And then the civilian Dutch people came, and to thank us, and brought their children and said they would always tell their children how important it was to remember the Canadians.
Weeks leading up to our coming over here for coverage, we expected that this would be one of the major events, the parade in Apeldoorn. We never expected it to be this big. A crowd of, estimated now by the organizers, of around 500,000. Well, quite a day. And the next day was special as well. London reliving the exhilaration of VE Day 50 years ago. They were the fighting men in appalling conditions, through blood and pain, ordinary men who found extraordinary courage to defeat the enemy. She was the wife of the king, badgered to leave the perils of London, but who would not. Personal safety an afterthought to rallying her country.
50 years after VE Day, the veterans and the Queen Mother.
Well, you see the balcony here above me at Buckingham Palace? Well, do you remember those shots from 50 years ago? The famous black and white stills like this one. Queen Elizabeth, King George VI, Winston Churchill in the middle, and on the two sides, Princess Margaret. You just see the edge of her on the right, and Princess Elizabeth, now Queen Elizabeth, there on the left. Well, the surviving members of those five on the balcony here at Buckingham Palace again.
I'll never forget the people I met, braving those angry skies. I remember well as the shadows fell, the light of hope in their eyes. And though I'm far away, I sometimes hear them say, thumbs up, for when the dawn comes up, there'll be bluebirds over white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace.
you, Dave Vera. Ladies and gentlemen, what more fitting sight could there have been than the wonderful old swordfish flying over Buckingham Palace while the last part of that song was being sung. Here comes the Taylorcraft Auster overhead. It's flown today by Major Ian Cornell, AFC. During the war, the aircraft saw service in every theatre of operations, including Europe, North Africa, Borneo and Malaya. And now, what we've all seen when we were alive at that time, if you're old enough to remember the Dakota, the Douglas DC-3, the War Horse. It's based at RAF Coningsby in Lincolnshire and is flown today by Flight Lieutenant Ward. This particular aircraft saw service in Europe with the Royal Canadian Air Force. Here comes the Dakota coming over you now. It came to the Royal Air Force in March 1993 from Farnborough. Now, the big one. Very few people could not recognize the next aircraft, the Avro Lancaster, Mark B-1, also from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. This aircraft, one of only 2 Lancasters in airworthy condition out of the 7,377 that were built. It very nearly became a static exhibit at Hendon. Luckily, permission to fly this one regularly was granted in 1967. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Chatterton. Co-pilot, Flight Lieutenant Palmer. Navigator, Flight Lieutenant Diaz. And close behind, the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, the Sally B, owned by the B-17 Preservation Society, flown by Captain Sissons. It's the only airworthy example of this magnificent aircraft left in the United Kingdom.
Well, quite an air show right over the Mall in London. The crowd and especially the royal family enjoying this moment of a historic and vintage aircraft display right over Buckingham Palace in downtown London on this, the 50th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day.
And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Air Force of today pays a modern-day tribute with a flypast by the Red Arrows, based at Scampton in Lincolnshire. Squadron Leader Rams with the Red Arrows. A salute!
Fireworks over London 50 years later after the Red Arrows, the RAF aerobatic team, flies over downtown London. It's like the Snowbirds do, the Canadian Air Force on Canada Day and a variety of other air show days. It's all parachutes being dropped from the fireworks display. Quite a sight here. Fireworks being let off from behind Buckingham Palace, front and side, and the smoke wafting everywhere, including right over the balcony of Buckingham Palace. That's the shot down the Mall looking up towards the palace, and that's behind the palace, the gardens, and right in the heart of London. They died in foreign lands. They died on vast oceans. They died in the unforgiving skies. Killed before their lives had started. Killed defending freedom against the greatest evil the world has ever known. Young, courageous Canadian.
50 years after VE Day, remembering those who did not come home.
Remembering those who did not come home is all of our responsibilities, and it will especially be so as we go to the National War Memorial in Ottawa for the services taking place there on this, the 50th anniversary.
When the war started, Canada was just beginning to become a nation. On the day when the war ended, we had grown up. We had undertaken the responsibilities of nationhood, and we had paid the price that nationhood demands. And in this bittersweet remembrance of victory and of loss, we bless the names of all those who fought for Canada. Merci, thank you.
They were the darkest days of the 20th century. The monsters of Nazism in control, brutalizing, murdering, slaughtering. The world weeping an ocean of tears for the innocent, for the brave, for those who sacrificed so that decency could triumph. And the triumph did come.
50 years after VE Day, the joy of peace.
And hello once again from just outside Buckingham Palace in London. It has been an incredible day here of celebration, and the partying is about to begin over at Hyde Park. Well, with that, the beacon has been lit. And we're hoping to see pictures from a number of places now around Britain of similar beacons being lit.
Your Majesty, 2,000 beacons, for centuries the traditional means of announcing momentous events, are being lit throughout your kingdom. Carlton Hill, high above Edinburgh. Crowds are gathered there as they are in towns and villages all over Great Britain to celebrate the same message that caused unparalleled rejoicing 50 years ago tonight, the message of peace. Over the water in Northern Ireland, an unusual beacon sight afloat on the estuary at Bangor. As in the rest of the United Kingdom, the war exacted a heavy toll here on both the civilian and military fronts, uniting all the people in the fight against the common enemy. Tonight, they are united once again in their thousands in the name of peace and of reconciliation. And finally, Wales, where on the Brecon beacons over the past 2 days, 40 young people have been working towards this moment, building their beacon for youth on Penavan, one of the highest mountains in Wales. A task dedicated to those children, both on the home front and abroad, who for 6 years of their young lives were the innocent victims of a world at war.
Permission to light the beacon, Mom.
Light beacon! Caravana! Advance! Charge!
This beacon is dedicated to all those young people, both at home and overseas, children of the ghettos, the concentration camps, the war zones, and the Blitz, who were never able to celebrate the end of hostilities. And to those who, although they survived, were touched by the dark shadow of conflict and whose lives would never be the same again. We also look forward with hope and a commitment charged with the responsibility for the future and the prospect of a better, more peaceful world.
The next day, May the 9th, is the day Russia commemorates as VE Day.
Let this day be a day of remembrance, a day of unity of the forces of good, the day of cursing the fascism, and the day of hopes for a peaceful future and a stable peace. The 20th century is about to end. It will occupy its place in history as the time of great achievements of human spirit. Bless the soldier who saved the world from fascism. I bow to you, dear veterans. Congratulations, dear friends, on the anniversary of the great victory.
Well, time now to say goodbye from Apeldoorn. We hope you've enjoyed watching this videotape. All of us at CBC News were happy to be a part of making it. The freedom won 50 years ago was freedom won at a terribly high price. Remembering the sacrifices made by the men who fought and died for us seems the least we can do.
Shepherd will tend his sheep, the The Netherlands Board of Tourism is proud of its association with CBC, and we commend CBC on its coverage of the commemorations and celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Europe. From the bottom of our hearts, we say, dank u wel. Thank you to all Canadians for their wartime sacrifice overseas and at home. Let us remember,